April 30, 1945. The war in Europe was ending not with a roar, but with a suffocating silence beneath the streets of Berlin. Above ground, the Reich's capital had collapsed into a smoldering graveyard, buildings gutted by fire, Soviet shells cracking through concrete, and the last remnants of the Wehrmacht retreating through streets choked with dust and despair. But deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, in a dimly lit concrete labyrinth, the final act of the Third Reich was unfolding. Inside the Führerbunker, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and fear. Maps no longer meant anything, red arrows covered all of Germany. Adolf Hitler, frail and trembling, sat at a long wooden table covered in coffee stains and trembling hands. Around him were the loyal few, Eva Braun, still in her wedding dress, Joseph Goebbels, whispering delusions of final victory, and exhausted aides who no longer believed a word he said. Outside, the muffled thunder of Soviet artillery shook the bunker walls like the heartbeat of history itself. Above ground, the Red Army was less than 500 meters away. Berlin was finished. Yet inside, Hitler dictated his final orders, convinced that his legacy would endure beyond the ruin. Those in the bunker watched him drift between rage and resignation, a man crushed by the empire he built. At 3:30 p.m., the final message from the outside world arrived. The Soviets had reached the Brandenburg Gate. By dusk, gunfire echoed through the Tiergarten. Within hours, the last chapter of Nazi Germany would be written, not on a battlefield, but in a concrete tomb beneath Berlin. April 1945. Berlin, once the proud heart of the Third Reich, was now a city reduced to dust and rubble. By late April 1945, the Soviet offensive had encircled the capital from every direction. What had begun years earlier as Hitler's vision of a 1,000-year Reich had ended in only 12 years, its final days marked by chaos, delusion, and destruction. The streets that once hosted grand parades of the Wehrmacht now echoed with the cries of civilians hiding in basements and the roar of TV-34 tanks grinding across the cobblestones. The Red Army, commanded by Marshal Georgy Zhukov and Marshal Ivan Konev, was determined to crush the Nazi capital and capture Hitler alive. The Germans, under General Helmuth Weidling, defended a city that had already ceased to exist. Ammunition was scarce, fuel was gone, and the few remaining soldiers, old men of the Volkssturm and young boys of the Hitler Youth, were fighting not for victory, but for survival. As the Soviets closed in, Hitler withdrew completely into the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Constructed in 1943 and expanded in 1944, the bunker was designed to withstand direct artillery hits. It lay 8.5 meters underground, its reinforced concrete walls more than 4 meters thick. Inside were 20 small rooms, offices, bedrooms, communication centers, and storage areas. The atmosphere was stale, the air recycled, and the corridors lit by dim yellow bulbs. By late April, more than 40 people lived inside, secretaries, guards, doctors, and Hitler's inner circle. Outside, Berlin burned. Soviet Katyusha rockets lit the night sky in arcs of crimson fire. The Reichstag was under siege. The German lines had collapsed at every point. Yet inside the bunker, Hitler maintained the illusion of control. Every morning, he gathered his generals around the map table to issue orders to divisions that no longer existed, phantom armies he imagined could turn the tide. He refused to leave the city. Berlin, he declared, would be his Valhalla. Hitler's physical decline mirrored that of his empire. Witnesses described his hands shaking uncontrollably, his posture bent, and his speech slurred. He barely ate, surviving on simple vegetarian meals and copious doses of medication supplied by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. His psychological state deteriorated rapidly. He alternated between manic bursts of rage and long, silent spells of despair. Those around him, Goebbels, Bormann, Eva Braun, became shadows in a decaying court. Meanwhile, above ground, the Soviets advanced street by street. The battle for Berlin was fought with unprecedented brutality. Civilians were trapped in their homes or used as human shields. The once proud boulevards of Unter den Linden and Wilhelmstrasse were reduced to wastelands of ash. German soldiers fought from house to house, cellars to rooftops, knowing surrender meant imprisonment or death. By April 25, the Soviets had completely surrounded the city. Communications with the outside world were severed. Hitler's last remaining allies, Himmler, Göring, and Donitz, were either fleeing, negotiating, or plotting to replace him. When Hitler learned that Heinrich Himmler had tried to open surrender talks with the Western Allies, he erupted in fury. He ordered Himmler's arrest, declaring him a traitor. The Führer's world had shrunk to the dimensions of his bunker, his trust in anyone, gone. Inside, the daily rhythm was one of despair and denial. Secretaries typed Hitler's dictations for his political testament. Generals Weidling and Krebs delivered reports that grew worse by the hour. Hitler's dog, Blondie, wandered the corridors, a rare source of comfort. Eva Braun tried to maintain a semblance of normality, dressing elegantly, hosting small meals, even laughing occasionally, but the mood was increasingly surreal. The bunker was both a shelter and a grave. Above ground, the Soviet artillery intensified. Zhukov's first Belarusian front attacked from the east, while Kohn's first Ukrainian front advanced from the south. The two forces competed for the honor of capturing Berlin and Hitler. The Luftwaffe was non-existent, German armor was destroyed, and the few defenders left fought with fanatic determination. The Soviet casualties were enormous, but their advance was unstoppable. By April 28, the city's outer defenses had collapsed entirely. Fires raged across the Tiergarten and Alexanderplatz. The Reichstag, the symbol of German power, was surrounded. In the bunker, Hitler received the news that Mussolini had been captured and executed by Italian partisans. His body had been hung upside down in a public square. The message was clear: no dictator would escape judgment. That same night, Hitler made his final decision. He would not flee, nor be captured alive. He dictated his last will and testament, naming Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor. He married Eva Braun in a small ceremony in the bunker's dining room, the wedding attended by Goebbels and Bormann, the witnesses to a doomed union. Afterward, champagne was poured, and a faint echo of laughter filled the concrete halls. But even that could not drown out the rumble of Soviet artillery. As dawn broke on April 29, Soviet troops were within a few hundred meters of the Reich Chancellery. German soldiers reported hearing tank engines directly above. Hitler's final staff gathered one last time. Outside, the Tiergarten was an inferno of smoke and twisted metal. Inside, Hitler's eyes were hollow, his voice weak. He thanked his aides for their service and retreated to his private quarters. Berlin civilians, meanwhile, lived a nightmare. Thousands sought refuge in subway tunnels and basements, clutching what little food remained. The city's hospitals overflowed with the wounded. The Red Cross could no longer operate. Those caught between the lines were either shot or crushed in the bombardment. The total war Goebbels had promised had become total annihilation. In the final hours, the Führerbunker became a microcosm of the Reich itself, a place of fading loyalty, decaying hope, and the relentless approach of consequence. Hitler's generals knew the truth: Berlin would fall within days, if not hours. But none dared tell him directly. Every word was filtered through the illusion that Germany could still survive. On April 30, as Soviet troops closed in on Wilhelmstrasse, the sound of artillery was constant. Dust fell from the bunker ceiling with every nearby explosion. It was then that Hitler gave his last command: his body was to be burned after his death, to prevent capture or public display. He could not face the fate of Mussolini. By mid-afternoon, the last radio messages from the outside ceased. The once mighty Reich had shrunk to a bunker below a ruined city. Inside, Hitler prepared to end his life. April 30, 1945, Führerbunker, Berlin, Germany. By the morning of April 30, 1945, Berlin had ceased to exist as a functioning city. The streets were unrecognizable, a blackened maze of rubble, shattered glass, and the acrid smell of smoke that never lifted. The Red Army's artillery thundered continuously, shaking the ground above the Reich Chancellery. Inside the Führerbunker, the last circle of Adolf Hitler's regime waited for the inevitable end. At 10 a.m., the Führer emerged from his private quarters. His appearance startled even those who had grown accustomed to his decline. His face was ashen, his hands trembled uncontrollably, and his gait was unsteady. Yet his voice carried a strange calmness, as if he had already accepted the fate that awaited him. He greeted his staff one final time, thanked them for their service, and spoke briefly about loyalty and destiny. Those present described it as an eerie scene, a man once commanding millions now surrounded by barely 40 followers, trapped beneath the ruins of his own empire. Hitler then summoned his adjutant, Otto Gunsch, and dictated precise instructions for what was to happen after his death. His body and Eva Braun's, he said, were to be burned immediately in the Chancellery garden. "I do not wish my corpse to be put on display," he said, referring to the gruesome images of Mussolini's death days earlier. The tone was cold, detached, and final. In the narrow corridors, whispers filled the air. Some aides wept quietly, others drank to numb the fear. Goebbels and his wife, Magda, spoke in hushed voices in their quarters, their 6 children playing nearby, unaware that their parents had already decided that none of them would see another sunrise. Around noon, the situation reports arrived from the front lines. The Soviets had breached the last defensive perimeter. The Brandenburg Gate, the Reichstag, and the Tiergarten were all under Soviet control. German units were surrendering en masse or being annihilated. Communications were fragmentary, and every message carried the same truth: the end had come. General Weidling, commanding the Berlin defense area, informed Hitler's staff that the fighting could not continue beyond the next day. In those last hours, the bunker had taken on the atmosphere of a tomb. Eva Braun, newly married for less than 40 hours, tried to maintain a strange sense of calm. She changed into a dark blue dress, fixed her hair carefully, and smiled faintly to the staff. Those who saw her later recalled her composure as haunting, a quiet acceptance that her life was about to end beside the man she had chosen to follow to the grave. By 1 p.m., the thunder of artillery was deafening. Dust fell from the ceiling, lights flickered, and every impact sent vibrations through the concrete. Outside, Soviet soldiers were less than 300 meters from the Chancellery. The SS guards on the surface fought desperately, firing from shattered windows and trenches dug into the rubble. But the resistance was symbolic. Berlin's fall was only hours away. At approximately 2:30 p.m., Hitler and Eva Braun withdrew to his private study. Witnesses saw them walk slowly down the corridor, holding hands. Hitler carried his pistol, a 7.65mm Walther PPK, and a small cyanide capsule. He paused briefly to nod to those standing nearby, then disappeared behind the heavy steel door. Minutes passed. Then, at around 3:30 p.m., a single sharp sound echoed through the bunker. It was unmistakable, a gunshot. For a moment, no one moved. Then, Otto Gunsch and Heinz Linge, Hitler's valet, entered the room. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Hitler sat slumped on the sofa, a gunshot wound to the temple. Eva Braun lay beside him, lifeless, her lips stained blue from cyanide. The room was silent except for the rumble of distant explosions. Gunsch followed Hitler's last orders. With the help of several aides, he wrapped the bodies in blankets and carried them through the bunker corridor to the emergency exit leading into the Reich Chancellery garden. The scene above was one of chaos, smoke, fire, and falling debris. Soviet shells exploded nearby as they laid the bodies in a shallow crater. Gasoline was poured over them, and the pyre was set alight. Flames rose briefly, whipped by the wind and smoke, consuming the two figures who had brought Europe to ruin. Inside the bunker, the remaining occupants gathered in silence. Goebbels stood motionless, tears streaming down his face. Martin Bormann retreated to a corner, muttering about escape routes. The sound of the burning bodies outside mixed with the relentless pounding of artillery, a grim symphony marking the end of the Third Reich. In the following hours, confusion and despair filled the bunker. Goebbels assumed temporary leadership but refused to flee. He summoned his adjutant and dictated his final statement: "The Führer has fallen. The heart of Germany has ceased to beat." Later that evening, Goebbels and Magda poisoned their 6 children with cyanide, then took their own lives. Their bodies were burned in the same garden where Hitler's had been destroyed. Meanwhile, Soviet troops stormed through the ruins of Berlin, fighting block by block. The Reichstag fell at 10:50 p.m. on April 30th, after a fierce battle. Soldiers of the 150th Rifle Division raised the red banner over the building's dome, the symbolic victory over Nazi Germany. Inside the bunker, the last remaining officers debated surrender. General Krebs attempted to negotiate with Soviet commanders but was told that only unconditional surrender would be accepted. There would be no deals, no reprieves. On May 1st, the survivors in the bunker began to scatter. Some attempted to break through Soviet lines under cover of darkness. Most were captured or killed. Martin Bormann tried to escape toward the Spree River but was never seen alive again. Others, like Otto Gunschen Misch, were taken prisoner and interrogated for years after the war. Above ground, the Soviet search teams combed through the ruins of the Reich Chancellery. They discovered the charred remains of 2 bodies, later identified as those of Hitler and Eva Braun. Despite Soviet secrecy, word quickly spread that Hitler was dead. Across Europe, the guns of war began to fall silent. The fall of Berlin marked the end of the Third Reich and the final collapse of Nazi Germany. Within a week, Germany would surrender unconditionally. The cost was staggering: more than 80,000 Soviet soldiers killed, nearly 100,000 civilians dead, and an entire capital reduced to ashes. Yet in those final hours beneath the Reich Chancellery, history had witnessed something more than the end of a war. It had seen the collapse of a totalitarian world built on fear, lies, and conquest. The man who had once commanded armies across continents now died in isolation, buried beneath the ruins of his own making. For the men and women who survived the bunker, the memories of those last hours would never fade. The claustrophobic corridors, the flickering lights, the endless pounding of artillery above, it all remained etched in their minds. In their testimonies years later, they described not heroism, but despair, not loyalty, but exhaustion. The bunker was not a place of leadership, it was a coffin waiting to be sealed. The world above moved on, but beneath the streets of Berlin, in that sealed concrete crypt, the remnants of the Nazi regime faced the full measure of their downfall. Each minute that passed echoed the truth that had been denied for years: the empire built on terror could not escape its own destruction. April 30th, 1945. As the afternoon of April 30th unfolded, the final hours of the Third Reich were marked by chaos, final decisions, and an irreversible descent into annihilation. Above ground, the Red Army was pounding the Reich Chancellery from every side. Tanks rolled down Wilhelmstrasse, their treads crushing the remnants of cobblestone streets, while artillery fire tore gaping holes into the city's fragile skeleton. Every explosion sent vibrations through the bunker's reinforced concrete walls, shaking loose dust and debris. Inside the Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler's death had been confirmed. The gunshot, the cyanide, and the subsequent burning of the bodies outside signaled the definitive end of his command. Yet the shockwaves were not confined to him alone. Joseph Goebbels, already ailing under fear and despair, assumed the mantle of leadership, a hollow authority in a city that had already surrendered itself to fire. He moved through the dim corridors, issuing orders that no one could execute, for the German defenses were crumbling and communication lines destroyed. The bunker itself became a theater of the surreal. Military officers, secretaries, and aides scrambled to make sense of the situation. Radios crackled intermittently, delivering fragmented reports of Soviet advances. General Krebs attempted to coordinate surrender talks with the Soviets, only to be told that unconditional surrender was the only option. The final illusions of control shattered instantly. Outside, the Soviet advance accelerated. Soldiers of the 150th Rifle Division had reached the Chancellery Gardens where Hitler and Eva Braun's bodies had been cremated. Fire and smoke still curled from the charred pyres, a grim testament to the man whose shadow had dominated Europe for more than a decade. Street fighting continued fiercely around the bunker complex. German forces, largely demoralized, were systematically overwhelmed. The air was thick with smoke, gunpowder, and the screams of the wounded. Inside the bunker, the sense of impending doom was palpable. Goebbels and Magda made their grim decision regarding their children, administering cyanide in a room lined with maps and military briefings. The sound of artillery shook the walls as they executed their plan, leaving behind silence and devastation within the concrete labyrinth. Officers and staff watched in disbelief, unable to intervene, powerless to stop the final acts of fanaticism. As dusk approached, the battle above reached its climax. Soviet infantry and armor had penetrated the city center, capturing key buildings and cutting off all remaining escape routes. The Reichstag, symbolic and strategic, became the focus of intense combat. German defenders, composed mostly of teenagers and elderly men, fought desperately but with little coordination. Every street was a battlefield, every building a potential death trap. Within the bunker, the remaining officers realized the impossibility of resistance. General Weidling, exhausted and aware of the futility, issued his final directives for surrender, ordering units to lay down arms wherever possible. His words were met with muted acknowledgement. The once rigid military discipline had dissolved under the weight of hopelessness. As night fell over Berlin, the Red Army finally breached the Reich Chancellery perimeter. Soviet troops, advancing cautiously amidst the fires and rubble, discovered the exits to the bunker complex. They encountered sporadic resistance from SS guards, who were quickly neutralized. The realization of imminent capture spread panic among the few survivors still inside. In these final moments, the bunker transformed from a command center into a mausoleum. Corridors that had once hosted the Nazi elite now held only fear, despair, and the echoes of footsteps that would never walk again. Secretaries, adjutants, and soldiers huddled in corners, listening to the cacophony of destruction above. Every blast, every scream, every shattering window reinforced the certainty that the Third Reich had ended. By midnight, Berlin was fully under Soviet control. The Reich Chancellery had fallen, the Führerbunker sealed in its grim historical legacy. The final decision-makers of the Nazi regime, those who had orchestrated policies of terror, genocide, and war, were either dead, captured, or gone. The city itself bore the scars of destruction, streets littered with rubble, buildings gutted by fire, and a population traumatized beyond measure. The fall of the bunker marked not only the physical collapse of Nazi command but the symbolic annihilation of Hitler's vision. What remained was a devastated city, a defeated army, and the overwhelming reality that the age of Hitler was over. The climax of Berlin's destruction was not merely the capture of territory, but the final erasure of the ideological and personal dominion he had wielded from beneath the streets. In the darkness of that night, the surviving members of the bunker, a handful of aides, officers, and guards either surrendered to the Soviets or vanished into the ruins. Some were later interrogated, recounting tales of desperation, fanaticism, and surreal moments of calm in the face of utter catastrophe. Their testimonies would shape historical understanding, offering a glimpse into the claustrophobic horror of the Führerbunker's final hours. The climax of April 30, 1945, in Berlin was therefore not simply a military turning point but a profound human tragedy. The convergence of strategic failure, ideological collapse, and personal fanaticism culminated in a scene of unparalleled desperation. It was here, beneath the ruins of a city and inside the walls of a sealed concrete bunker, that the Third Reich met its irrevocable end. May 1, 1945, Berlin, Germany. The dawn of May 1, 1945, over Berlin marked a city in ruins. The streets, once thronged with civilians and soldiers, were now silent save for the distant rumble of artillery and the cries of the wounded. Smoke lingered in the sky, painting a permanent grey over a city that had been the epicenter of Europe's deadliest war. The fall of the Führerbunker and the death of Adolf Hitler had signaled not only the collapse of Nazi command but the beginning of a new reality, one defined by occupation, surrender, and the grim task of survival. Soviet forces systematically swept through the devastated city. Soldiers moved cautiously, wary of remaining pockets of resistance. The Red Army encountered collapsed buildings, booby traps, and the scattered remnants of German troops who had refused to surrender. Yet the primary objective was clear: secure the city and ensure the complete eradication of the Nazi command infrastructure. The Reich Chancellery, once the seat of absolute power, was meticulously searched. The charred remains of Hitler and Eva Braun, burned as per his instructions, were located and documented. Soviet soldiers, recording every detail, understood the historical significance of the site, the end of an era that had begun in fire and terror 12 years earlier. Beyond the military sweep, Berlin's civilians faced a different reality. Tens of thousands had survived the battle, but basic necessities were scarce. Food, clean water, and medical care were nearly non-existent. Hospitals overflowed, with doctors working tirelessly amidst the ruins. Corpses littered streets and basements, creating both a humanitarian and psychological crisis. The survivors' accounts reveal scenes of desperation, families scavenging for scraps, mothers carrying injured children through rubble, and the pervasive fear of disease. The aftermath extended beyond physical destruction. Politically, Berlin became a city under occupation. Soviet authorities assumed immediate control, establishing military governance to prevent chaos and maintain order. German citizens were subject to curfews, registration, and searches, while mass arrests targeted former Nazi officials, SS personnel, and anyone associated with the regime's crimes. The process of denazification, though imperfect, began in earnest. Citizens were forced to confront the reality of the atrocities committed in their name, the concentration camps, mass executions, and systemic oppression that had defined Nazi rule. For the surviving members of the Führerbunker, fate varied. Otto Gunsch and Heinz Linge, Hitler's adjutants, were captured by Soviet forces. They were interrogated extensively, their testimonies forming the basis for understanding the final hours of the Führer. Others, such as Martin Bormann, vanished into the chaos, leaving historians to piece together their final movements from sparse records. Joseph Goebbels, having committed suicide, left a legacy of fanaticism and tragic obedience, particularly in the death of his 6 children. Internationally, the death of Hitler and the collapse of Berlin reverberated across the globe. Leaders in London, Washington, and Moscow recognized the symbolic and practical significance of the city's fall. Adolf Hitler, the figurehead of Nazi power, had been removed, leaving a power vacuum that Admiral Karl Donitz attempted to fill. Donitz, named in Hitler's will as Reich president, sought to negotiate surrender to the Western Allies, hoping to spare Germany from complete Soviet occupation. These efforts culminated in the signing of unconditional surrender documents in Reims on May 7, effective May 8, Victory in Europe Day. The psychological aftermath was profound. For German citizens, the fall of the city marked not liberation but the shock of defeat. Propaganda that had glorified the Führer and demonized the Allies had been erased in a single week. Survivors grappled with guilt, loss, and the overwhelming devastation surrounding them. Meanwhile, the Allied powers faced the immense task of occupying and reconstructing a shattered nation. Berlin itself would become a focal point of the emerging Cold War, divided among the victors and serving as a living reminder of totalitarian collapse. The fall of the Führerbunker also left a legacy for history and memory. Photographs, documents, and eyewitness testimonies from the bunker provided unparalleled insight into the final moments of the Third Reich. Roches Misch, the telephone operator, would later recall the surreal mixture of routine and apocalypse, the mundane acts of service juxtaposed against the unrelenting advance of enemy forces and the implosion of absolute power. These accounts emphasized both the human fragility and ideological obsession that had driven the Nazi leadership to its ruin. Culturally, the aftermath shaped narratives for generations. Berlin's ruins became a symbol of both warning and consequence. The Führerbunker, though largely destroyed by Allied demolition, entered collective consciousness as the final tomb of a dictator. In the years following the war, historians, filmmakers, and writers would reconstruct the events within its walls, blending testimony and archival evidence to illuminate the human and political dimensions of collapse. The social fabric of Berlin had been irreparably altered. Families were broken, communities destroyed, and millions of refugees displaced. Surviving soldiers faced imprisonment, trials, or forced labor. The psychological scars of witnessing the city's destruction, combined with the horrors of the Nazi regime's atrocities, created trauma that would echo for decades. For the world, Berlin's fall represented the cost of unchecked authoritarianism, a stark lesson etched in concrete, rubble, and human suffering. By May 8, 1945, the city streets were quiet except for Soviet patrols. The destruction was nearly total, monuments toppled, government buildings reduced to shells, and the infrastructure of daily life obliterated. Yet in that devastation, the seeds of reconstruction were planted. Berlin would eventually rise again, but the memory of the Führerbunker and the horrors it contained would forever remain a cautionary tale of power, obsession, and human folly. In conclusion, the aftermath of Hitler's death and Berlin's fall was multifaceted. Military victory, civilian catastrophe, and historical reckoning converged in a single, apocalyptic week. The world had witnessed the collapse of a regime that had wrought unparalleled destruction, and the human stories emerging from the rubble, survival, despair, and testimony would define the post-war era. The Führerbunker, once the heart of power, had become a silent witness to history, its walls etched with the final acts of a doomed ideology and the irrevocable consequences of tyranny. April 30, 1945, Berlin, Germany. The fall of Berlin and the death of Adolf Hitler beneath the Reich Chancellery's concrete vaults marked the definitive end of Nazi Germany. Yet the significance of these final days extends beyond military defeat. The Führerbunker, once a symbol of absolute power, became a tomb of illusions, fanaticism, and human tragedy. It serves as a stark reminder that no empire, regardless of its reach or terror, can withstand the combined forces of reality, resistance, and history. Those who survived the bunker's final hours offered testimonies that reveal the human dimension of collapse. The fear, confusion, and despair they experienced were compounded by ideological devotion and personal loyalty. They witnessed leaders they had revered reduced to shadows of their former selves, trembling, irrational, yet still attempting to control the uncontrollable. Their memories captured not heroism, but the fragility of authority, the consequences of fanaticism, and the profound isolation that comes with the end of an era. Above ground, Berlin's ruins symbolized the catastrophic cost of war. Civilians, soldiers, and the city itself bore scars that would take decades to heal. Families were torn apart, neighborhoods obliterated, and the social fabric shattered. The events of late April and early May 1945 became emblematic of both the destructive power of totalitarian regimes and the resilience required to survive their collapse. In a broader historical context, the fall of the Führerbunker offers lessons in leadership, obedience, and the dangers of blind loyalty. Hitler's final hours illustrate the peril of isolation from reality and the consequences of ideological obsession. The bunker's confined corridors, claustrophobic atmosphere, and relentless pressure from advancing forces created an environment where delusion and despair intertwined, producing choices that would have catastrophic human consequences. The world remembers Berlin's fall not only as a military milestone but as a moral reckoning. The stories emerging from the Führerbunker humanize history, reminding us that behind the headlines of war and the statistics of casualties are individuals, flawed, fearful, and often complicit in the machinery of destruction. The events of April 30, 1945, stand as a testament to the ultimate failure of tyranny and the enduring cost of unchecked power. Today, the site of the Führerbunker is largely unmarked, hidden beneath modern Berlin. Yet its legacy endures in history books, photographs, survivor accounts, and scholarly analysis. It is a place of reflection, where the consequences of ambition, ideology, and human cruelty converge. The fall of Berlin serves as both a cautionary tale and a lens through which future generations can examine the fragility of power, the endurance of truth, and the profound human capacity for both destruction and survival. In the silence that now covers the streets of Berlin, the echoes of those final hours beneath the Führerbunker remind the world that history's lessons are eternal, that the rise of tyranny can be swift, but its collapse is often inevitable, and that the human cost of ambition without conscience is a burden.